Good morning, everyone. My name is Ian Moise, and I'm Senior Director of Water Services at DT Global. Thank you for joining us today to discuss the topic of climate change, conflict, and WASH, improving service provision in an unstable world. Please note we will be answering your questions through the chat function. Feel free to ask a question there. If we cannot answer your question today, we will certainly get back to you with a response via email. Let's jump right in. 70% of the world's fresh water is used for agriculture. Another 19% of total water withdrawals are used for industrial purposes. It's an understatement to say that water is the foundation for life on this planet. And yet 2 billion people live in water-stressed countries. Globally, at least 2 billion people also use a drinking water source contaminated with feces. These issues are only exacerbated by conflict, climate change, and population growth. UN Water argues that water is the primary medium through which we will feel the effects of climate change. Higher temperatures and more extreme, less predictable weather conditions are projected to affect availability and distribution of rainfall, snow melt, river flows, and groundwater, and to further deteriorate water quality. In 2019, Nature magazine asked experts about climate as a risk factor for armed conflict. These experts agreed that climate has affected organized armed conflict within countries. They also found that intensifying climate change will likely increase the risk for future violent armed conflict. They estimated that climate change and climate variability has influenced between 3 and 20% of armed conflict risk over the past century. Add to this the impacts of migration. UN Secretary Council Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the forced movement of large numbers of people around the world will clearly increase the potential for conflict and insecurity. UNHCR estimates 82.4 million people were forcibly displaced in 2021, most by conflict. Half of those were children. WASH issues too are exacerbated by global conflict. As UNICEF Director of Emergency Programs Manuel Fontaine said, when the flow of water stops, diseases like cholera and diarrhea can spread like wildfire, often with fatal consequences. In fragile countries, children under the age of 5 are 20 times more likely to die from diarrheal disease than to violence. As international development practitioners working in some of the world's most challenging environments, we must take all three of these challenges and their intersection into account in order to design truly effective development programs on behalf of our clients, stakeholders, communities, and people around the world. We are fortunate to have three very accomplished and diverse experts with us today to help us investigate how the climate change, conflict, and WASH nexus threatens resilience in communities. First, Dr. Tammy Tabe, originally from the Solomon Islands, holds a PhD in social anthropology and is currently Oceania Research Fellow at the East-West Center. She brings expertise with marine protected areas, community and ecosystem-based adaptation, and climate change-induced migration and displacement, among others. Second, we have Lemessa Makonta from Ethiopia. He is a hydrogeologist by background with over 23 years experience in the water and sanitation sector. Currently, he is country director for IRC WASH Ethiopia based in Addis Ababa. And finally, we have Celine Kadena, a South Sudanese WASH expert who holds a master's in public health. She currently serves as social behavior change advisor on USAID's AFIA WASH program in South Sudan. Celine brings firsthand life experience at the intersection of our three topics: climate, WASH, and conflict. I'm going to ask three questions and each panelist will provide their responses in turn. Tammy, I'm going to start with you. Here's the first question. Climate change is a threat multiplier and barrier to investment for WASH development. What incentives and blended solutions can we envision to increase and accelerate WASH investments in environments subject to climate change? And a bonus question, what will this mean for conflict? Over to you.
Thank you, Yan, and thank you for having me on this platform to share insights about climate change and its impact on WASH projects, as well as specifically water resources. And I would really want to speak today from a social and cultural perspective, and mainly reflecting on Pacific Island countries as well. Climate change has been affecting Pacific Island countries in different ways. And as Yan, you mentioned in the introduction, that water is essential for life and also for livelihood. And I think in the case of the Pacific Islands is really, really important as well for their survival. Water is distributed differently across the Pacific Island regions, and you will know that in higher islands, there's more water resources available compared to atoll nations. In terms of your question, I think one of the things that can be done to perhaps accelerate the implementation of WASH projects in the Pacific Islands is basically WASH projects have already been implemented in the Pacific Islands through various organizations as well as CSOs. But one of the things working in this area in the Pacific is the need to really increase an understanding of the place, the people, as well as the governance and leadership structures, specifically in the Pacific Islands, because it's such a diverse region. So when it comes to decision-making and implementation processes, different islands, different communities, as well as different governance structures implement things differently. And so when it comes to implementation of projects, implementing a project in a particular area does not mean that it will work in another area as well. And so one of the things that's really crucial to ensure that projects are sustainable, that have long-term impacts, is really understanding the physical, the environmental context of the community or the islands, understand the cultural relationships, as well as the setting of the community in order to implement the project. And usually when projects are implemented, there's a lot of integration of decision-making bodies as well as people. And I think one of the things that's really important in the Pacific Islands context is really understanding we always look for challenges and issues when it comes to water resources in communities, particularly in the Pacific Island countries, because of our vulnerability, our fragile environments, and also our very poor economies. But I think it's also important as well to look at the strength mechanisms that are already in existence in the communities, and how this can be further improved, especially in relation to access to water, what kind of water resources are available in these areas, how water is used, how water is distributed, as well as how water is managed. Sometimes it's not about implementing immediate solutions to the needs of the communities, but really understanding the governing structure and the leadership structure that oversee the use of water resources as well as access during times when there's lack of water, and also during times when there's surplus water.
Great, thank you very much for that answer, Tammy, for the response. Very interesting and good to understand the context of the differences within Pacific Island communities, which is perfect application for the world writ large, the differences between places and people and things. So thanks very much for that. Now over to Lemessa for the first question. Climate change and conflict are threat multipliers and barriers to investment for WASH development. What incentives and blended solutions can we envision to increase hope and accelerate WASH investments in environments subject to conflict and climate change?
Thank you, moderator, for having me as one of the respondents to your question. My name is Lamessa Makonta from Ethiopia, one of the countries in East Africa prone to extreme climate variabilities such as drought and flooding. So my responses will be in line with these contexts. In my understanding, there are 4 basic ways of incentivizing WASH investment in such fragile areas. And the first one is institutionalized coordination among emergency respondent actors and WASH development actors. So this coordination would help to identify complementarity between the 2 interventions. And the second one is properly documenting and sharing good practices, how emergency responses and development interventions are leveraging each other. Then showing that to other actors as a good practices. And the third one is on having a clear accountability mechanism in place, how the 2 interventions can complement each other. And finally, having a flexible funding for such a geographical area is really has an immense contribution for that. When I say flexibility funding, implementers or donors must be willing in switching on and off from one intervention to another, because emergency or shock can happen at any time. Then there has to be a means of switching on from one intervention, like from emergency to long-term solution, which is a development. Or whenever such emergency happens, there has to be a way of switching on from long-term development or solution to short-term emergency responses. Thank you, moderator. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Lamesta. Thanks for the comments. Now I'd like to ask the same question to you, Celine. So again, I'll repeat the question. Climate change and conflict are threat multipliers and barriers to investments for WASH. What incentives and blended solutions can you envision to increase and accelerate WASH investments in environments subject to conflict and climate change?
Thank you, moderator. I'm Celine from South Sudan. South Sudan is one of the countries that is prone to flood, drought, and conflict. Last year in December 2021, actually, we had one of the massive flooding after 60 years of the country without those kind of happenings. So I've come up with a number of blended solutions that if put in place, will be able to improve on challenges that arise as a result of climatic change. And one is establishment of quality design adaptation structures in areas prone to floods. For example, building elevated water points and sanitation facilities that cannot collapse during flooding seasons. In other words, improvement of quality of infrastructures and designs will lead to reduced collapse of sanitation facilities during the disaster. And that investment can still be useful after the flooding subsidized. Secondly, investing in water storage mechanisms that minimizes high rate of evaporation in areas prone to drought will be able to maintain the level of water for use even if the season is dry. I also look at establishment of temporary water distribution systems that can enable transportation of clean water from conflict-affected areas to where the population has temporarily settled. For instance, during the conflict in some parts of South Sudan, the displaced population had no access to safe drinking water and sanitary facilities, sanitation facilities. So the response team that provides support through help from United Nations established the temporary treated water distribution system and temporary toilets to the displaced population until the situation normalizes. Increase the resource allocation by different stakeholders for climatic change to meet the Sustainable Development Goal 6 of ensuring that everyone has access to water and sanitation facilities. Establishment of innovative social enterprises for sustainable development. For example, alternative energy saving source for cooking, using cooking briquettes made from locally available materials like cow dung, tree leaves, fermented vegetations to reduce deforestation. By doing that, we will be able to reduce the climatic change that is caused by cutting of trees for making charcoals. Use of alternative local materials for construction, for instance, non-brick, non-bounty bricks through community-based approaches training. Establishment of pollution control and better sewage treatment systems to reduce on water contamination. And lastly, massive continuous awareness and education on climatic change to the target population, which contributes to increasing waterborne diseases, hunger, increased illiteracy, while noting that water scarcity itself is a source of conflict and gender-based violence, since women and girls are primary collectors of water in most parts of the developing world, including South Sudan. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for both those responses, for all three of those responses, excuse me. So now we'll move on to our second question. Tammy, here's a second question for you. Climate change causes water scarcity as well as water surpluses. How can early warning systems improve wash service provision, and what solutions might we design to capture water surpluses to our advantage? Over to you.
Thank you. I think it's true that climate change does cause water scarcity as well as water surplus in various regions. I think Pacific Island countries are highly vulnerable to climate change, and I think even more now, it's really crucial to work together with the science as well as the traditional knowledge of how the climate, predicting climate conditions in various places across the Pacific. There is a lot of focus now in using current scientific predictions about rainfall and precipitation. And also this also create warning systems for communities as well as islands that are located in various regions that might be affected or may not be affected by heavy rainfall. And in such case, in relation to your question about how water surplus can be perhaps better managed or captured in the Pacific Islands region. One of the issues, and perhaps like one of the biggest challenge in the Pacific Islands is water storage. And so the islands are very diverse environmentally, geographically, and also in terms of rainfall distribution. There are places that will receive more rainfall than the others. In different parts of the region. And so it's really important, first of all, to really understand the sort of like the meteorological conditions and predictions of the different islands where WASH projects are to be implemented. So for instance, if you're looking at an area that you want to implement WASH projects, it's really, given the current conditions of climate change and its impacts, I think it's really important to really work with the scientific predictions so that the implementation of the projects actually addresses the future needs or the present needs of the communities. So for instance, if you're looking at an atoll nation of Kiribati, now, if you're comparing it with an area that might receive more rainfall than an atoll, what kind of solutions would be suitable for an atoll area compared to one that perhaps will receive more water? And in this case, as I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges is water storage. And this is common across the region in places where there is a lack of water and in places where there is surplus water. I think one of the things that needs to be considered is when we talk about water surpluses, where are the water surpluses? What are the sources of these water surpluses? Is it from rainfall? Is it from rivers? Is it from lakes? There are various sources of waters across the Pacific. And so to understand that will really help sort of like provide insights as well to what kind of projects that WASH can bring about into this community. So if you're looking at an island or an environment setting that is dependent on rivers, rivers with more rainfall will provide more water for people, but how do you channel this water so that households and families can benefit from it during heavy rainfall and during times when there is no rainfall? And I think one of the things that has come about from research is the lack of storage facilities or infrastructure for water resources across the Pacific. When I say storage facilities, I'm not referring specifically to households, but looking at communities, looking at the island, what kind of storage infrastructure can be created so that water can be stored during the times when it's plenty, when there's a surplus of it, and also during times when there's a lack of it. And I think this is a common issue, not only in high islands in the Pacific, but also in atoll islands. And so I think really understanding the water resources, the sources of water in these various places, and how projects, perhaps WASH projects, can be implemented to capture this surplus so that they can sustain the community during periods when there is lack of water.
Great, thanks very much for that, Tammy. Very interesting to hear about the context, the different elevations, and how that affects the different solutions that we need to consider in the island context. Lamesa, this question is now yours. Again, I'll repeat the question. Climate change and conflict both cause water scarcity, whereas climate change increasingly causes water surpluses, flooding. How can early warning systems improve WASH service provision, and what solutions might be designed to capture water surpluses to our advantage?
Thank you, moderator, again. If I take Ethiopia as an example, this is a vast country having different agroecology, lowland, highland, and the midland, and where we have different intensity and amount of rainfall on annual basis. And some of the areas have rainfall deficit, and others have immense rainfalls. And in those lowland areas, rain is usually just for a short duration. So always having early information or having a capacity to forecast things is really a plus. Early warning system can provide what is ahead of us. If we incur drought, for example, on regular basis, while we have high intensity rainfall just for a short duration, then we have to be able to retain those surplus flow during high rainy season or the peak season. So this solution really involves both behavioral change, which is about water saving and also water use, and engineering solution, which involves putting some engineering structures in place. If I begin with the behavior, it is like more of at household level, at community level, on how societies need to conserve water and how households need to use water both for livestock and domestic purposes. And as engineering solution, we can think of surface water retaining, such as dams, depending on the contexts, or we can think of subsurface storage, like recharging shallow groundwater and to use during the drought season. Of course, this all depends on the environmental contexts. So we have to do both on behavioral changes as well as on the engineering solution to retain and use the surplus water flow during peak rainy season. In some part of the countries, as this is already practiced, but it is not widely really practiced yet. Thank you. Back to you.
Great. Thank you very much for the response, Vanessa. Very interesting answers. Let me turn the question over to Celine. Celine, again, I'll repeat the question. Climate change and conflict both cause water scarcity, whereas climate change increasingly causes water surpluses. How can early warning systems improve WASH service provision, and what solutions might be designed to capture water surpluses to our advantage? And I know, given the recent flooding in the last couple of years in South Sudan, this is particularly relevant. Looking to hearing.
Thank you, moderator. Early warning systems will help governments and different stakeholders to be well prepared and design appropriate interventions, such as establishment of water storage systems during time of surplus, and which can be used during time of scarcity as an early warning mitigation system. Secondly, we can invest in flood mitigation infrastructures. For instance, elevated water and sanitation facilities, which can be constructed, and they can, in case of flooding, they will not be destroyed, and the population can still come back and use their investments. We can also establish mobile water treatment in scenarios of conflict where the population is displaced from their residence to a temporary settlement to handle the situation until the conflict situation gets to normal. While conflict is usually a planned kind of activity by the perpetrators, but it comes as a surprise to the communities that are affected. What is required, however, is to promote peace and reduce potential conflict source so that we will be able to control some of the losses that occurs during man-made kind of disasters. What solutions can we drive from the surplus to our advantage in case like flooding? So we recommend that establishment of crop plantation that boom in wetlands like rice, sugarcane, and exploitation of aquatic resources as business. For example, use of papyrus in paper industry will be very useful. It will drain the water as well. It will be generating income for the population. As well as food to address the issues of hunger in the area. Thank you.
Great, thank you all three of you for responding to our second question. Now we will move on to our third and final question. Tammy, the question goes to you. How do we address water service provision when acute emergencies become chronic? How relevant is the humanitarian development bifurcation as nature blurs the line between emergency and development?
Thanks, Yan. I think when we talk about it's really true that there is a blurred line between emergency and development. And I see that it's becoming a challenge in the Pacific Islands region. And I'm speaking based on my experience and working together with different CSOs as well as humanitarian groups. Often humanitarian intervention is often seen through the lens of development. And so when there is an immediate need for intervention from organizations outside of the region or within the region, there is always that hope that it's going to contribute towards the development of a certain area, a certain community or an island. And I think that can be very misleading, and it might pose greater risk into the future. I think it's really, really important when working with national institutions as well as not NGOs, churches, or any other organizations that are within that will be facilitating or assisting in delivering humanitarian. I think it's really important first to really clarify what is the work of the humanitarian organizations, especially when intervening during crisis or during emergency situations. In the Pacific, there's that issue. So humanitarian sometimes is often considered or seen through the lens of adaptation and then development. And so there is more expectation to just an immediate intervention to assist the immediate needs of the communities that are in crisis. So in this case, when we talk about water, it's about just providing water facilities that will sustain or help families or communities through that period of time without really investing into what it's going to be like into the future. Often now policies and regulations are framed around intervention that sort of like it's tailored towards development, and sometimes it puts pressure on institutions that are intervening as humanitarian organizations as well as bodies. And so there is a clear need for that. And that is not only important at the national level or the provincial level in the case of the Pacific, but also really instilling this kind of understanding at the community level. When for instance, when there is a tropical cyclone or there is drought in communities, sometimes communities just wait for intervention, humanitarian intervention by the government or outside organizations without really understanding that this is just, the intervention is just to address the immediate need, and it's not something that's going to help them in the long run if this issue or this crisis or this challenge keeps reoccurring. And so I think that's one of the things, and it's something that we've talked about in the Pacific. And also it's really important not only looking at the community's perspectives and expectations of interventions from humanitarian organizations, but really also having organizations, humanitarian organizations, understand how their interventions are affecting or impacting communities, or in this case, Pacific Island countries. There needs to be a clear guide, or perhaps like just clear insights into their work as described by humanitarian, as well as what's tailored towards development. And I think that's sort of like the challenge that humanitarian organizations in the Pacific also face because of the expectations that placed on them when they're intervening to address issues that communities face during water crisis or other disasters.
Great, thank you very much for that insightful response, Tammy. Really appreciate it. Now I'll ask Lamesa the same question. How do we address water scarcity when acute emergencies become chronic? How relevant is the humanitarian development bifurcation as nature blurs the line between emergency and development?
Thank you, moderator. Once again, in countries like Ethiopia, climate change simply aggravates those problems that are already there. When I say those problems that are already there, it includes low access to wash services, low quality of wash services. If climate change comes on top of that, then really it can cause many disasters. So my response to this is just simply about building the local system. We need to build the local system, including building the resilience of community and wash actors at local system. What does this mean? This means we need to clearly understand the root causes of those problems and understanding the local context as well. Once we understand and compile them, we can prioritize for intervention, prioritizing for short-term solution, medium-term solution, and a long-term solution. Emergency response comes maybe as a short-term solution, but it cannot be a long-term solution for these areas. So once we prioritize, then we can strategize and plan for intervention. Again, those interventions are not really simple. They are challenging. We have ample experiences in Ethiopia on this. One of the challenges is they require intensive capital investment, which government or any wash actor cannot afford at a time. And the second one is systems change. It really takes time to see the result, which might discourage both the donor and the implementer. So there has to be a clear understanding on those. But in any case, once we prioritize and categorize them into short, medium, long term, then really we can find a way how emergency responses can feed into long-term development and how long-term development intervention also can support emergency responses. One good example is in a work we recently involved in with different actors in lowlands of the country, like in southeastern and the eastern part of the country, where we were able to identify high-yielding deep boreholes that serve a number of communities, pastoralist communities, plus livestock. So having those boreholes in place and establishing near real-time monitoring system to monitor on the water usage and also on the status of those boreholes really can help a lot, because we know how much water is pumped on daily basis from those boreholes, and how many people are served, how many livestock are served on daily basis from that boreholes, and also the status of the boreholes, whether it has any electromechanical problem or discharge problem, and so on. So a timely solution can be sought based on those near real-time solution. So if emergency respondent actors complement on those kinds of initiative, this is how we can seek for long-term solution. So emergency response should really be seen as a short-term solution, not as a medium or even long-term solution. But we should not deny that emergency can happen at any time. But what matters is the way we respond to it. And also those emergency response shall not really hamper or damage the local system, like the supply chain, the market system, the roles of local government actors or local service providers. So if we pull all these things together, really we can find a sustainable solution for wash services in those fragile environments. Thank you. Back to you.
Great. Thank you very much for that response, Lamesa. Very interesting and very comprehensive. Also very representative of Ethiopia and the different challenges that you think again. Celine, let me turn to you for your response to our last question. I'll repeat the question and then look forward to your response. How do we address water service provision when acute emergencies become chronic? How relevant is the humanitarian development by condition as nature blurs the line between emergency and development? Celine, over to you.
Thank you, moderator. Looking at the context of South Sudan, I think South Sudan is one of the countries that is really disadvantaged when it comes to both natural disasters and man-made disasters. As we talk today, we have a big number of displaced people who were once very settled in their homes, despite the level of poverty that they have, but they were able to provide for their daily needs. Unfortunately, these people have to get displaced from where they are settled today, POCs, or to where the IDPs are being helped. It is a very common thing. As we talk now in South Sudan, I think we have more than 5 or even to 10 POCs where thousands of mothers and children are being contained. What I can say is that how do we address water service provision when acute emergencies become chronic, like in South Sudan? The only thing we can do now is to come up with the interventions that are community resilient. We have to build the community resilience for sustainability. For example, I was in Western Baragazal in Wao, and there were people who were displaced some years back in 2015. And I think time came now, they are tired of being in the POC, because the young girls who were like 5 years, now they are making 15, I mean, they are going to 12 years to 15 years in the IDP camps, and their services are not as you expect in your home. So communities are coming up with the resilience where they start coming out of the POCs by themselves to start initiating private activities so that they are able to generate income instead of waiting for what is given there at the camps. So what I can say in the context of South Sudan, where emergencies is almost a daily kind of problem, is that we just need to build or come up with the innovations that build the community resilience. And we can do this through strengthening the community ownership, through planning with the community, through understanding the local context of the state or of the county or of the community, so that we are able to come up with a very effective intervention that will solve the problem of the community through identifying the root cause of the conflict, or through identifying the problems that has always caused emergencies. While for development in South Sudan, it's possible in some few counties, but for now, the country is at a state of recovery. So most of the project designs or most of the plant activities have to fit under resilience and recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Celine. Thank you very much for that response. I'll now take a minute to summarize some of the salient points from our panel. With respect to blended solutions and how they can increase and accelerate WASH investments in climate and conflict affected contexts, we heard about the importance of coordination, accountability, flexible funding, innovation, and continued awareness, especially relating to differences between places, people, and governance structures. In response to our second question related to the role early warning systems can play in improving WASH service provision, for example, in capturing water surpluses, we heard about the importance of early warning when rainfall is heavy but short-lived. We understood the importance of the climate science and hydrogeography, behavior change, infrastructure development, especially water storage, and innovation, such as advancing agricultural production that thrives in wetlands. A new one for me was understanding the more central role papyrus can play in the paper industry. Lastly, we looked at the sometimes arbitrary and blurred boundary between emergency and development WASH assistance and how these two worlds come together, especially under chronic climate or conflict-induced conditions. We talked about the need to build local systems and resilience, to clarify roles of humanitarian and development organizations, and to understand the root causes of problems. Expense and time were identified as constraints. With that, we conclude our panel on climate change, conflict, and WASH, improving service provision in an unstable world. I'd like to thank our three esteemed panelists for sharing their expertise and experiences, and thank all of you for listening in, asking questions, and helping us dig into one of the most pressing topics in our changing world. You can learn more about what DT Global is doing to address these challenges at dt-global.com. I want to thank the organizers, sponsors, and SID for having us today. Have a great rest of your day and enjoy the remainder of the conference. Bye.